I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle, and we're about to do something we've never done before. And Bill Whittle, may I ask, why are we doing this?
Well, my friend, the times they are changing, as you may have noticed. It's uh, it's a different world than it was when we got started back in 2008, and I thought for pretty much the entire duration of the last 10 years that things like the firewall and the graphics and the flame and the things disappearing and all these things add a lot of time. But I thought it made the show more credible because it added production values. But in the age of YouTube and user-generated content, that's not what's selling, especially if we're trying to reach new people, younger people. Apparently, the real thing now is intimacy and authenticity, and I can fake that anytime. So as soon as that thought came to me, I thought, all right, so let's just do it. And I also realized that it's getting harder and harder for me to write things because so much of what I've talked about before. But I also find that I'm getting much, much better live. And I thought I was pretty good to start with. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to be taking live questions, certainly from the BillWhittle.com membership, and we'll fill in the gaps with the MeWe page. And so that there's going to be content every day. We're going to have it on every single day. We'll do 5 of them a week. And instead of timeless topics, there'll be something a little more newsworthy. So those of you with medical conditions or in abdominal pain or sleeplessness or something will have a chance for you to finally find some rest and some peace. So I'll just give you my 5-10 minutes on everything as it happens. So let's get going.
Now, the first example is not going to fit into that burning news because this was such a popular question that I decided to ask this from Benjamin Nelson, who's one of our viewers at our Right Angle MeWe group. And he said, yeah, I thought this was a great question. What questions would you ask a brand new political candidate who had no voting record? And how do you evaluate him when you've got nothing to go by?
I'm a big believer in this radical idea of the people being able to govern themselves. And I would simply ask what the person had done in the real world. And if they'd succeeded in the real world, that'd probably be good enough for me. Ideally, they'd be a small business owner. Because I think more than anybody else in the country as a group, small business owners understand the pressures of the economy. They know what the tax burden does. They know what the regulatory burden does. So if I were to run into a candidate who had run a successful small business, that's good enough for me. There's a great game out there, an old computer game called SimCity, Scott. And SimCity is where you get to control building a city. And you just start out with this open plain, and you start plunking down residential sections. Then you add commercial sections. You build a road. And depending on how you balance your taxes and everything, the city starts to grow. And I don't think you should be allowed to serve in public office in America until you can play SimCity, run a city at a profit for 10 years. Because you learn things like when you turn that tax rate up from 4% to 7% because you need more money, all of the commercial buildings start to collapse and decay. And next thing you know, you've got, Venezuela.
Now, Bill, don't you think that you need to go through sort of the checklist and have them give intellectual assent to the creeds and the doctrines of the party?
Having people qualified for office has never slowed this country down before, Scott. I'm not entirely sure that anyone has ever been elected to office in this country that could pass the kind of test that ideally I would like them to pass. I don't think there should be a requirement of it. Needless to say, my confidence level would increase dramatically if they could tell me what the 3 branches of government were, if they could tell me what the 3 levels of government were, if they had some fundamental idea about natural law. Actually, of all the things I think that are pertinent, I think that's probably the most important one politically. I would want to know if the candidate in question understood the fact that the Constitution doesn't grant us any rights whatsoever. I really would like to find somebody who really understood that the First Amendment does not grant us the right to free speech, the Second Amendment does not grant us the right to keep and bear arms, that all of these rights are intrinsic to us. They belong to us the second they enter the world, and even a cursory reading of the Bill of Rights shows you that the First Amendment does not grant you the right to free speech. You have the right to free speech at birth. The First Amendment says that the government cannot take it away. The government cannot take away your Second Amendment, says that they can't take away your inherent natural right to self-defense. And if I had a candidate who understood that these rights come from God or from higher source than politicians, and therefore couldn't be taken away by them, I'd feel a whole lot better about that person. I'd probably put out a loan sign.
And the our interlocutor here, Benjamin Nelson, seemed to be getting at the how can you tell that this person is sincere? And so when you say what you just said, I'm thinking I want to hear that stuff come out of his mouth without me asking about it. But even then, I think that a lot of people who run for office know what they need to say to appeal to the base, so to speak. How do you evaluate whether you can really trust somebody?
That's a great point too. Political office favors people who are pretty slick rhetorically. The ability to lie convincingly seems to be the number one prerequisite for the job. Certainly, it's gotten a lot of people further than any other skill or quality or virtue I can think of. And I would say, to that extent, I might think it might be a good exercise to look at what the person says, but read it in print, because many times you find that people who are not terribly eloquent are right on the money. They're just not terribly great public speakers, and I'm not hiring them to be interesting. I said hiring them because that's really what it is. I'm not hiring this person to represent me in Congress. We're paying them because they're an eloquent speaker. I want them to be able to understand the fundamental problems with the country and the area I live in, and sometimes two negative things can happen. You can be positively influenced by people who have really bad ideas but have them laid out very slickly and big smile and can sell you any bad idea. And the second thing is there are many people out there with perfectly good ideas and perfectly capable of executing them, but they're just not terribly good at public speaking. I said that George Bush, English is his second language, and he doesn't have a first language, and that doesn't mean, as the left assumes,
the guy's like a Yale graduate or something, isn't he?
He's a Yale and Harvard graduate and a fighter pilot. Yes. So, but eloquent he's not, and so many people on the left make the mistake of confusing rhetorical intelligence with actual intelligence.
And I wasn't planning to ask you this, but let's end this little segment on this, because another one of our viewers, Pat Wilson, you just led me into Pat Wilson's question, frankly, and he says, Bill, why don't you run for office? At the very least, it would be an educational process for you, and may I add, Scott Ott adding here, that it may enrich the content well from which you draw to do what you do.
Kind of you. I'm sure I can just run for office in my spare time. Look, here's the actual answer, Scotty. First of all, I prefer to make an honest living, and we, Steve and I, and all of our viewers of Right Angle and Trifecta, and me especially, learned an enormous amount about any kind of politics from watching an actual virtuous man go into the political field and see what kind of things he runs up against. So there's that. I don't want the job. I don't want to have to spend my days sitting to other people gassing on about things they know nothing about. That's my job. And then I think finally, I will say this. I was at an event this last weekend. I just spoke in front of a group of people in the afternoon. We were talking about the California gubernatorial race and the Republican candidate who, needless to say, I'm going to vote for, and who I think everybody should vote for, but who comes across, I think, as very slick and not terribly authentic. And somebody was asking me about, why don't I run? And I said, if I was running, I'm specifically talking about the California campaign for governor. If I was running as the Republican, my entire campaign, all of it, would consist of holding up the iPhone with the app that allows people to see where the concentration of drug needles and human feces is in San Francisco, so they don't have to walk through the actual mounds of human waste that are on the streets of San Francisco.
They have a feces and syringe heat map app?
They do.
Wow.
And they need it. And so I would never, ever, ever, ever let Gavin Newsom off of that. You were handed not only the most beautiful city in America, but certainly the richest one in America, with Silicon Valley right at your doorstep. You can't say that we don't have any money to do this with in San Francisco. The reason that there's human waste on the streets of San Francisco Mr. Newman, is because this has been your policy for San Francisco. This is what you think is a priority for San Francisco. You want to fine people $1,000 for taking a plastic straw, but you're handing out as many hypodermic needles as the shipping will allow. And I would like to know why that is. And I'd like to know why it is that you can't own a goldfish, apparently, in San Francisco, but you can defecate on the streets in front of City Hall if you want to. Now, I would say, Mr. Newsom, I don't know what your motivation is, but I suspect I have a guess. I really do. I think people like you are so convinced of your own superiority to other people that on some level that you may not even be aware of, it rather suits you to think that you're up there in your high, clean office while the rest of the commoners are down there literally walking through the filth that common people have to deal with every day. If you got a better explanation for that, I'd love to hear it. And I said this at the event, and people said, if you were running, you'd be governor. And I kind of thought, I probably would be, So I don't know.
Well, yeah,
it's a lot of money.
That's the best job I've ever heard anybody do of answering a question in the negative that only makes us want you more. I mean,
thank you.
That's
my entire career.
Well done. Ladies and gentlemen, for Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible. More to come. Stay with us.